Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of a series of 4 conversations that we're having globally around science, education, open societies, as the British Council, with friends and colleagues across the UK, but also across the network. I'm delighted to have a fabulous group of speakers with us today. We've got Professor David Drury, who's a non-executive director of the science portfolio of the UK Commission for UNESCO. Welcome, David. I know you know the British Council well, having sat in this seat in the past. We've got Dr. Julie Maxton, who runs the Royal Society. Thank you again. And also Professor Carol Mundell, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So collective IQ of a small nation between the three of them. So what we'd like to do is to invite each of our speakers to say a few words on also Professor Carol to say a few moments on what their point of view around the UK as a science superpower, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So what I'd like to do is maybe start with Professor Carol Mundell. Carol, can I pass over to you?
Thank you, Kieran. It's a great pleasure to speak to you all this afternoon on a really important subject. It's really exciting to hear the Prime Minister's ambition around the UK as a science superpower. I am an academic by background. I'm a physicist. I'm head of astrophysics at the University of Bath, and I have always collaborated internationally. So I really, care about the strength of our international collaborations, but also, the real strength of the UK research, development and innovation base. Through our universities, our learned societies, our small medium enterprises across the whole of our sector. Really, I think we have a huge amount to offer, and we're recognised internationally as a great place to come to do research, development, innovation, and grow new businesses. So I think the fact that our government has put that really at the heart of their strategy and have been very clear and vocal about that is also very exciting. It lets us really harness all of that and put it into a really strategic framework. We have the integrated review, which is going on at the moment, and that brings together a major review of our foreign policy, our defence, security, and our development portfolios. And then, of course, that's only one piece of everything that we do, but really looking across the whole landscape from influence, development, prosperity and security for the UK in the international context, and the UK as a force for good. So that's something that, I work on very much as Chief Scientific Advisor in our new Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And I think the formation of that exciting new department really, again, exemplifies the ambition of our government for bringing all of those pieces together. We have, a world-leading development department in the Department for International Development, and bringing that together with our world-leading diplomatic service in the Foreign Office has been, a really strong move in terms of making sure that we can deploy our world-leading science and innovation in some of the most vulnerable countries and work together as partners really to increase stability and prosperity around the world, which is good for all of us. And I think, the COVID crisis has really shown how we are a connected world, both for good and for ill. And actually, we do have to work together if we're going to have an open world where we can travel, we can be safe, and we can improve one another's lives worldwide. And I think touching onto that really is trust between scientists and organisations, trust between the general public and scientists. We see that is very, very good in the UK. We have a world-leading public engagement portfolio, both our museums, the Science Museum in London, our museums across the country, programs, for example, the science programs that run on channels like the BBC. I know any time I speak to my friends internationally, everybody's heard of Sir David Attenborough, and I think, wonderful communicators, but right through to our universities, where our young people coming into university, starting to do their undergraduate degrees or their PhD research, are already communicating very well with members of the public who have a really keen interest in the science that that we do in our country. And so I think, you know, it's a really exciting time in government to be actually making sure that we have all the right resources in the right place, both nationally and internationally, that our systems are fit for purpose, and that we can continue to have that world-leading, internationally outward-looking, collaborative country, so that we can really push the frontiers of knowledge and see the societal benefits from that. And I think finally, just to close, we have some major global challenges that we do all have to collaborate on. Climate change, you know, is not going to go away, and the devastating consequences of that we see playing around the world already. And so I think the pandemic that we've seen impact every country differently, and obviously devastatingly, will be a small crisis in comparison to the global challenge of things like climate change if we don't tackle that. So much hope for the future, but much work to do. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carol. Julie, can I come over to you from point of view from the Royal Society?
Thanks very much, Kieran, and thanks to your colleagues at the British Council for inviting me along. Can I build on what Carol has said? Science is essential for UK jobs. It's essential for health and well-being and improving quality of life for us and for other peoples around the world. It also has a role in shaping the UK's relationship with other countries, bringing benefits both ways. Excellent research and innovation is increasingly international, and the UK has strong relationships around the world, which it needs to preserve and extend. Let me give you some numbers. 40% of the academic workforce in science, technology and engineering, and more than 50% of the postgraduate student population come from overseas. More than 50% of the UK's research output is the result of international collaboration. 33.5% of UK research papers are co-authored with other EU and associated countries, and 17.5% with the USA. Two recent events have impacted on the trust between scientists, institutions and the public, but I'm confident that it can be built back. The first, of course, was the COVID pandemic, which has tested the public's trust in science, even although the recent Ipsos Mori survey gives a majority, 62%, continue to have positive attitudes towards science and trust in scientists. But this has fluctuated in response to events such as the resignation of Neil Ferguson. It's important, I think, that we retain our independence and our transparent and open approach to work as a scientific body, and that we give everybody the tools to engage critically with science, including promoting science education and the scientific method. The second event that has impacted trust is that Brexit has shaped the perceptions of researchers working in the UK and overseas, compounded by ongoing uncertainty over the UK's future participation in European science programmes and mobility. Perception is difficult to quantify, but very important. It's not only about whether someone can come and work in the UK, but whether they want to, and clarity whether their future is needed. Science itself provides a path by which to rebuild trust internationally. Scientific links have been built and sustained between individual scientists in different countries throughout history, whatever the political situation, thereby providing a strong base for developing future relations. Some of the key moments in the history of the Royal Society are the result of international scientific engagement, and working with partners around the world to tackle global challenges continues to be a priority for us. Mobility is very important to delivering this. The UK enjoys considerable benefits from the mobility of researchers, including a healthy and vibrant research ecosystem in the UK that attracts and benefits from many of the best minds, and access to international networks that bring considerable soft power. In the UK, researchers come from all over the world and have chosen to work and live here because of the funding opportunities, a welcoming and supportive environment, and the opportunity to work with other leading scientists. But outward mobility is also important too. 91% of National Academy Fellows and grant holders report that mobility was very important to their careers. 72% of active UK researchers have trained or worked as researchers abroad. And more than half of National Academy of Fellows and grant holders report that at some time during their career, they've spent a sustained period of a year or more working abroad. So, to harness the benefits of science as both a national asset and a universal activity that transcends individual country interests, i.e. secure our position as a truly global science superpower, we need the government to choose to do the following. Be an active participant in European science. Be ambitious in creating new deals with leading and established science nations around the world. Ensure that the UK is an attractive destination for researchers and innovators. Use the Office of Talent to make the UK an attractive destination, reducing the upfront costs of work and study visas in line with our international competitors. And agree reciprocal arrangements on international mobility as part of the UK's future trade strategy. We also need the government to take advantage of the UK's leadership in science to build stronger international relations. We play a lead role in convening a number of multilateral networks, and significant opportunities exist in the coming year to use science as a soft power asset. I mention only 4. Climate Change 26 Conference of the Parties, commonly known as COP26, the G7 Summit, the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity, Conference of the Parties 15, COP15, and the G20 Summit. And finally, as I mentioned, we should give everybody the tools to engage critically with science and its benefits. In that way, we will promote science education, we'll ensure that science is transparent and open, and we'll also support a healthy trust in science and engagement with its findings. Thank you very much.
And finally, I managed to unmute myself. David, over to you, David Drury.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and it's a pleasure to be with you on this British Council event. Let me start by talking about urban areas which are particularly exposed to the impacts of climate change and natural hazards, hitting obviously the poorest and the most marginalised people around the world. In Indonesia, for instance, recent extreme flooding and destructive tsunamis have emphasised the urgent need to build the resilience of coastal communities. British scientists, alongside Indonesian colleagues, have developed new and integrated strategies for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation to safeguard homes, centres of economic growth, protect businesses and infrastructure. The joint research, which won one of the 4 Newton Prizes last year, has influenced the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO and its coordination group for tsunami warning by improving their approach to tsunami preparedness and priorities. Furthermore, the research can be adapted to other coastal areas at risk, such as we in the UK, where we are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surges. So this example, one of very many, exemplifies a different cut, I believe, through the science superpower construct and spotlights, number 1, how the UK can perform science at the highest international level. 2, provides a benefit to humankind. 3, strengthens the UK's international reputation. And 4, has a direct application to circumstances in Britain. And I call this the 4 wins formula. Well, let me now return to UNESCO, which I'm representing, and I can remind you all that it's an international organisation focused on education, science and culture. It was founded 75 years ago this year in London, born out of the horrors of World War II, with the goal to build the defences of peace in the minds of men and women. UNESCO Science today is pursuing and delivering many of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations: climate change, poverty elimination, clean water, affordable clean energy, sustainable cities, and the like. The UK's government R&D, the Research and Development Roadmap that was published 2 months ago, has called for our intellectual talent and insights to tackle these greatest challenges that face the world. And in a sense, our very best science serves both our own country and acts as a force for global good. Now, I've been asked to say something about the impacts of COVID-19 on our UK science. And in the context of UK UNESCO science, it really revolves around the activities of a large number of our UNESCO designations, all of which have been adjudicated to be of outstanding global importance. 7 biosphere reserves, 8 global geoparks, and other centres that are science related, such as Jodrell Bank World Heritage Site and the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland. Now, I should just say that our designations showcase science in practice to our various publics, at home and overseas. The latter through collaborations and the many millions of foreign visitors to our designations who see British science active and overwhelmingly successful in conservation, environmental protection, setting high standards and working closely with our communities. Now, these designations are being affected by COVID-19. The development of collaborative projects, for instance, has slowed with partners overseas in Europe, Africa and Asia. Staff have been furloughed and finances hit from volatile visitor numbers and stakeholder retrenchment. On the other hand, they have all continued to engage the public in science. For example, at the global geoparks of the English Riviera in Devon, in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland and on Anglesey, online activities and learning hubs have expanded, providing interactive educational resources. Social media involvement has ramped up with interviews and podcasts. Work has expanded with local and national economic and tourism partners to main interest in and the relevance of science in the community. So, while the future may be uncertain, I remain confident that UK science in the global UNESCO context is resilient and will continue to be active, authoritative and influential. As we said, building a block in constructing those defences of peace in the minds of women and men worldwide. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant, David. Thank you so much. Now we have a few questions which participants sent in early. So while people come through, I might start with those if I may. Karen, can I turn to you first? This kind of global engagement. How do we make sure that it's a kind of a whole of the UK effort? And I don't just mean the kind of 4 nations of the UK, but that smaller institutions which might have a brilliant specialty also get to participate globally. We've got humanities research as well as scientific and STEM research, as we would say. How do we make sure sort of these kind of global engagements, for all the good reasons you outlined, are made available to everyone?
Thanks, Kieran. I think that's a really good question, and it really draws together many of the threads that David and Julie have already mentioned. And I think we can't have a successful international influence if it's not deeply rooted in our communities at all scales. I grew up in the northwest of England. My family are Scottish and Welsh, so I feel very connected to many regions. And I think what I've seen in my role as CSA, both in the Foreign Office now and in the FCDO, is the scale of projects, from the smallest community projects that start as a seed corn, the influence that they can have if we have the right networks to deploy their impact internationally and connect them with fellow groups around the world, right up through our universities. And we have, really world-leading universities spread across the country. So they're not concentrated in one particular region, they're all across our country. And I think our universities are very mindful and very active in their roles in their local communities. And I think think, you know, one of the things that's really struck me, and, you know, David made some beautiful examples of this with UNESCO work, is the incredible innovation that we've seen coming through the COVID crisis. And so people have really transformed the way they've worked because they've had to. We've challenged many of the assumptions in the way we previously maybe needed to travel. And we started to think about how we engage differently, and we use technology to do that. So I think one of the keys for me is making sure that the country's infrastructure is fit for purpose. I know that's something that sits again, you know, at the heart of government interest, that we make sure that all communities can access modern technology, not just in terms of the infrastructure, but also the skills. So I think the skills agenda is really important, that all of our communities are accessing education and training at the right level so that they can, you know, really develop their potential, and then use the autonomy within those communities to be able to deliver the sorts of projects that are authentic for them. And I think when we look internationally, we then start to see the real impact of those sorts of collaborations. And I was struck very much with the work that our Arctic scientists, for example, have been doing, collaborating with scientists over in Siberia, in Russia. And, you know, both of those research groups had very different kinds of data. They had very different kinds of approaches, and they became very good collaborative friends. And they're now working at the frontiers of climate research for the benefit of both of our countries, and also for our world understanding of the impact, particularly of things like forest fires, and how we create a resilient world to climate change. And so it was really the funding mechanisms were important there. So not a huge amount of money, but the right kind of agile funding structures to make sure that those researchers could really work together in an agile way. And I think the other point really is, as well, is the UK is very visible internationally, because we do have students, as Julie said, who come to study, you know, across our country, you know, from the Highlands and Islands all the way down to Cornwall. I myself went out, I was a young researcher, and I lived abroad for a couple of years. And again, it completely changes your view of your own country. And those connections really are for life. You know, you end up having really two homes, the country that you've lived in, or the countries that you've lived in, the friends that you've made there. And I think that also produces an incredibly important network of stability. And going back to David's comment about world peace, that when you have an understanding of other cultures and you have friendships that you've built there, that's how you build future collaborations. It's how you think of business partners going forward. And it's how you start to think about connecting your communities from the national and the local level right out into the international with like-minded people, or people with similar challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I think I have a sticky button. No, thank you. Can I just pick that up and maybe pass it on to David or Julie if they want to comment? So, you know, in the British Council, you know, what Carol has just said is very dear to our hearts, because the fundamental belief behind the British Council that if we can connect people and we understand each other and we recognise that we have to work together on common problems, and it's about our similarities, not our differences. You know, and that kind of explains our programming. It's about connecting young early career researchers, or it's helping people learn to communicate their science through English, which is the global language of English. How do we sustain that in difficult times? You know, when travel is restricted, so those conferences that early career researchers would naturally go to probably can't happen. Maybe in some places funding is more difficult than others. How do we create this kind of momentum? Because, you know, the UK may be brilliantly committed and brilliantly organised in many aspects of this, but you need counterparties as well. Julie, David, any thoughts?
Thanks, Kieran. I think we need to pay attention to making science accessible, not only to the researchers who are our counterparts, but to other people in their countries, as well as to people in our country. So I think we need to develop better dialogues between scientists, social groups, and decision makers. And we need to improve our dissemination of science to all the different publics, and diminish the communication modes which minimize doubts or exaggerate promises. And in other words, go to the heart of science, its rigor, its integrity, its reproducibility. And I think in that way, you can do everything that Carol says and everything that you've been saying, Kieran, but we also should be able, everybody should have the possibility to engage critically with science. And from the perspective of the Royal Society, doing that as early as possible in the school's curriculum and advocating for that elsewhere in the world, I think it really can change how science is viewed. It's not over there and people in white coats. It's fundamental, it's central. And as I said at the beginning, it's critical for jobs and for health and for the furtherance of humanity.
Thank you. David?
Well, yes, thanks very much. My take on this is from the UNESCO perspective. And of course, UNESCO is already extraordinarily well connected around the world. And even if in our own country, with our designations that we have, they cover all regions and all parts of the United Kingdom. And a lot of the differences that we see that might have political overlays really do not affect us that much in terms of the overall strategies and the way in which the designations operate. They may get funding in different ways by going to different governmental organizations, and they may have other structures that they have to operate in, but their philosophies and the way that they are driving science forward and engaging their publics and engaging students and others who are undertaking science, whether it be in a geopark or whether it be in a biodiversity area, is pretty much the same. And having said that, of course, they then have these global geopark and biodiversity reserve networks that extend all over the world, and they are sharing their views and their thoughts with their colleagues at various meetings, which of course today have to be undertaken by some sort of video conferencing. But I think actually the level of that stepping up has in some instances enhanced the ability of people to meet together. Because when you are actually using aircraft and other forms of travel and you have busy schedules and diaries, maybe the participation rate is not as high as it is now, where a lot of people can actually meet together. And let's face it, one of the most important things that we want to do is to engage young people, students, postdocs, early career researchers. And these people are very used to using all forms of technology to communicate. They're doing it all the time, unlike people like me who are sort of a little bit older in their careers, which find it interesting, but not absolutely natural. So I think we have to go through this process of interacting in that way at the moment, and hoping that then interpersonal meetings will come along in due course.
Thank you very much. Can I take one other question that came in before, and then I'll pick up one or two that are appearing in the Q&A. It's this debate which goes on about blue sky scientific research versus applied research versus very targeted, national priorities. How does one make the right judgment in terms of where to target one's resources and one's efforts? Karen, do you mind if I start with you again?
Yeah, sure. Okay, all the hard ones. I think it's again a really important question, and something that I think sits at the heart of much of the work that we're doing in government. I think I have three observations really. The research that I do is astrophysics. I study how black holes form and evolve in the universe, and you can't really think of anything more blue skies than that. But of course, the kinds of big questions that we are trying to actually ask, and it goes back to what Julie said about the scientific method. So the idea of studying the physical world, trying to understand the laws of physics in the most extreme environments, all of that has to have rigor. And, when I go to engineering colleagues and say, is it possible to do this experiment? And they tell me no. And then I go back and say, no, but please, can we try this? Then we get some innovation. I'm being a little bit simplistic about it, but we come up with these big questions, and then we really need to understand whether we can actually answer them. And I think the discovery of gravitational waves was a beautiful example of that. It's pushed the technology in quantum optics optics, in terms of, photonic fiber, material science, all sorts of frontier physics subjects that will now pull through to be applied in our society and in all sorts of imaginative ways, have come because we wanted to understand the nature of space-time, and we wanted to test the theory of general relativity that Einstein formulated and published. Nearly 100 years ago, it was thought that this was just science. It wouldn't even be science fiction. And so I think many of the big applied breakthroughs that we have now, for example, GPS, and that that underpins the billions of dollars worth of precision agriculture around the world, would not be possible if we didn't understand the laws of physics. And so I think that's the big idea. And obviously things happen on different timescales. One doesn't want to sit and wait 100 years before you can have an economic impact. And I think the role that government has is to put the right systems in place. So I think it's incredibly important that we have researchers, for example, through our research councils, UK Research and Innovation Board, that actually sits and says, well, here's the funding allocation. It's peer reviewed. You have bottom-up curiosity driven research, and that's across all of our subjects. You mentioned the humanities, equally important there. And I use science in the very broadest sense, not just, as Julie said, people in white lab coats. And then I think it's really important that we have the pull through to innovation, because obviously we want to have the economic benefits of the science that gets done. Otherwise, we don't have the money to go back and fund that research. But equally, the applied and the challenge led is also really important, because the way you get big scale breakthroughs is when you have big challenge led questions, and then you help the researchers to mobilize underneath that. And I think, that's where some of the big breakthroughs have come, because that's what encourages interdisciplinary research in ways that researchers themselves as individuals may not step up and say, well, I would like to answer this question and I'll pull a team around me. So there are levers that we can pull, and I think that you have to have all of it, and it's about getting the balance right. And that may also depend on where your particular country is at a particular time as to which bits you invest in more, or whether you want to develop, say, the innovation pipeline more, or whether you feel that your fundamental research base, your foundational research, needs to be supported more. And that will depend very much on the country. And then I think finally, going back to what David and Julie said, again, it's about the people. You have to make sure that you have your talent pipeline, and the culture of research is very important. It should be inclusive, and we should be driving on diversity, because it's diverse teams that bring the best answers to the hardest questions. If we all look the same, we all think the same, or we've all had the same lived experience, then the answers that we get to those questions, and indeed the questions that we formulate, will be very limited. Thank you.
Thanks. David, and can I just chuck another question in as well at you? We talk about world-leading science, but how do you measure it? Is it number of citations is the question? Is it number of patents, if you want to be more applied? How do you know you're having great science? Just because you say you are you really?
Well, I'll come in on that first one, that last one that you asked, Kieran. How do we know that we're doing so well? Well, I think there are a lot of parameters and measures that we can use. I mean, you've already talked about the issues like the number of citations, and how we perform as a country against others, OECD, or the world in general. Undoubtedly, when you look at it, we are performing much better than the averages for these groups. I mean, I think in terms of world researchers, we have about 4%, and our population is 0.9%, so we're clearly doing extremely well there. Citations equally well. We are well above the normal averages, and I'm sure that both Carol and Julie will have some statistics to share on that. But I'd just like to come back to the earlier question, which was to do with basic science and applications, and how you stimulate and how those interact. I think it was Carol that mentioned work in the Arctic. I'd just like to reflect on the fact that one of my starting points was about sea level in Indonesia. Well, world sea level is climbing very, very steadily, and indeed it is accelerating. One of the key areas for understanding sea level change is actually at the other end of the world, in the Antarctic, which is part of my own research background. And there you have got studies going on at the moment in which British scientists and American scientists and other international players are looking at the way part of that large ice sheet in Antarctica responds to ocean and atmospheric warming. And it is stimulating a lot of young people undertaking fundamental research in glaciology, geophysics, remote sensing and modeling. Developing new pieces of equipment to look at the undersides of large floating plates of ice to try to understand how these dynamic areas respond to climate and how they will in the long term influence something, which is of dearest concern to us in London, and that is flooding as well as in other cities. And the people who are doing the research are doing fundamental research and developing new techniques. But the application could not be more practical important to us internationally.
Brilliant. And David, only you could combine urbanization and the Antarctic in your research. A question, two questions if I can combine them. One is from Research Professional News saying, can our status and this overperformance survive the consequences of withdrawing from the European Union, particularly if it's a no-deal environment, is the question. But equally, what's the difference between our approach in the UK and other scientific countries, France, Germany, United States, Japan, wherever? Julie, you've travelled the world in your role. Any thoughts?
Well, two parts to your question. Can we survive the Brexit conclusion, whatever it might be? I think just picking up on one or two things that Carol said, I think everybody's working very hard to make sure that we have an ecosystem in place that supports all different kinds of scientific research, from discovery science research through to innovation, application, etc. Because, of course, discovery science is beloved of the fellowships with whom I work, but there are different types of science, and every country has its own problems that it needs to solve, and it may have thematic calls or challenges for research. And I think that's absolutely valid, and it can help with a country's positioning. I'll give you one example on that. I'm working with judges to look at how to improve the science in the courtroom. Now, what we found, briefly put, is that there are areas where judges and practitioners in the courtroom would like there to be science, but it's not the sort of science that the researchers choose to do. So that's the kind of example, and I'm working with UKRI and the head of one of the research council to see how we can, through a challenge-led approach, see if we could close that particular gap in the landscape. And that would be very significant. It would be leading work for the UK to do that. So I agree with everything Carol says, and just add that example. How do other people, well, we know other countries organize themselves somewhat differently. There are broad similarities, but some countries, let's take Germany, they have a comprehensive network of Max Planck institutes, Fraunhofer, etc. And other countries have less of those. We have both in the UK, universities and institutes, and sometimes it works well together and sometimes it doesn't. Japan has a very active research council, but all of these countries, and so does France, which I'm very familiar with, but all of them actually, I mean, in terms of Brexit, to bring round to the beginning of your question, all of the European ones would have liked us to, from a scientific point of view, there's a huge support for Britain participating in European science. And I think we should continue to participate in European science. It will be on a different basis depending upon the way we leave the EU. But it's up to us, I think, to make it work. And countries make things work in different ways, and ours is changing at the moment, but we're very committed to helping.
Thank you. Can I change tack slightly? The development agendas, and Carol, you are now the CSA for a department which combines international policy, diplomacy with development. What about that balance? Because there's always the tension between research for prosperity, research for development, being a force for good. I know something dear to all our hearts is widening the participation in science. So as I'm an engineer, tends to be fairly male dominated around the planet. What about providing those opportunities for women as well? How does that kind of force for good and altruism play into the work that scientists and science diplomats do?
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, I mean, I actually don't see a conflict between development and a science superpower. I think they're all integrated. I think, as Julie said, and also David, the key is the excellence in the work that we do. And I think in terms of diversity, we have a program, Girls Education, 12 years of education for girls around the world, particularly in vulnerable countries or conflict areas. Girls are 2.5 times less likely to be in school than boys in conflict areas. And of course, we see gender-based violence against women and girls as a major tool of war. And so we know that if young people, particularly women and girls, get education, because they are the linchpins of their families, of their communities, that they can fundamentally change the way a vulnerable country, its trajectory. And so we know that education is a real key there. So that is very much at the heart of the Foreign Secretary's strategy. I think how we approach that campaign, again, we can apply the scientific method, make sure that it's evidence-based, that we understand that we're measuring any programs that we run, that they are effective, and that we work in partnership with the local communities, so that we don't seek to preach, but we actually work with communities to be sure what works. And I think, as David said, some of the big global challenges, we don't see a lack of interest among girls, it's a lack of opportunity. So it's really opening those doors, and whether that's fundamental science, the nature of the universe, whether it's tackling challenges that impact girls and young women's families and communities, they are bright, talented, and they want to engage. So the question is, how do we enable them to do that, whether it's in a conflict zone, whether it's in a peaceful zone, whether they're actually traveling to the UK to study, or whether we're helping them within their countries. So I think there's the engagement, there's the inspiration, and then I think, more broadly, once you are in a system, and I think this is very much true for the UK, and there are many active groups working on this, tackling the cultures within our science environment. And this is something that's been very close to my heart throughout my career, both in terms of mentoring young men and young women, looking at poor behaviours. And I know this is something that's very close to Professor Dame Ottilie Laser's heart, and she's just become the Chief Executive of UKRI. And, our minister yesterday wrote a very, very strong speech about the ethics and the behaviours that we sometimes see that are poor in academia particularly, and this is something that I think limits opportunities. So, I am a woman physicist by background. It's a very male-dominated field. I have some wonderful male colleagues who I work with very much, and I've worked with them for many years. But I also see some really poor behaviours, and we call it a leaky pipe. But actually, young women who are coming through, in particular, and experiencing bullying or harassment, and are leaving the field because they don't see a future for themselves. So I think it's fundamentally important that we change that we are seen as leaders. We have to be making sure that we are the best version of ourselves we can at home, before we can then go and project that and help others around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
Yes, thanks. I'd just like to add a rider to Carol's very clear exposition about that and this issue between articulating our research and the development agenda. This falls fairly clearly in some of the areas that we in the National Committee for UNESCO are involved in. I'll give you one example, and that is that we are, through our expertise in our global geoparks, advising people in Kenya in regard to the development of a bid for a geopark in the Great Rift Valley. I mean, the Great Rift Valley is one of those unbelievable places for studying geology. You know, it is a rift that will open, it will become an ocean. Volcanologists, geochemists, geophysicists, you name them, they are wanting to study that for fundamental principles. But what we can do is to bring them into the communities locally who want to create this geopark which mixes the science with community development, and particularly to bring women in and those who are much less able to access education, to bring them to understand what the science is all about, and for them to share and be part of a colossal development for them in their country. And it will be internationally recognized. So it's, again, it's part of my sort of 4 wins formula.
Thank you. Another tack, if I may, what do young people think of when they hear about international science collaboration? Do they think about the grand schemes, you know, the CERNs of the world, or do they think about kind of mobility? And then how do we encourage you know, that mobility to continue, and how do we make sure that the UK retains its position in that kind of, not competition, but in that kind of scheme where, you know, great scientists move around the planet? Julie, can I start with you?
Yes, certainly. I'll come back to one or two of the points that I made at the beginning about the importance of mobility and how 91%, for example, of the fellows of all the national academies in the UK have spent time abroad. Mobility is really important, particularly post-PhD, but also to come to a different place to do a PhD. So there's plenty of examples of that. And as I mentioned, more than 50% of the PhD population, it comes from elsewhere. So one group of those who are heading for a research career certainly think about mobility. I think it's amazing how well good scientists find other good scientists in their field. They read the literature, they have networks, and they know where they want to go, whether it's America, whether it's here, or France, or Germany, or wherever. And I think it's incumbent upon us, in a way, to help with schemes which will bring them here if it makes sense to bring them here, but also which will help them go somewhere else if they want to go somewhere else. Because as Carol said, you end up with 2 or more homes, and often people will come back. And if they don't come back, they'll still think very well of the UK. It's a soft power which is quite amazing around the world. I used to go to lots of places, and all the time you'd meet people who'd come to the UK for training and were still connected through those relationships. So I think it's incredibly important, because no one country can have a monopoly on scientific research. Science is an international endeavor, right in its very fundamentals. And that's why no country should be out of bounds, but different countries will have different strengths. And I just finished with one example on the development side, that we have a program in Africa, the Royal Society, which has the acronym FLAIR, which stands for Future Leaders in Africa - Independent Researchers. And this is a program which we work with the African Academy of Sciences, and it gives talented Africans the chance to stay and work in Africa. It doesn't bring them out of Africa to the UK, because plenty of programs have done that, but it keeps them in Africa and gives them opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have. So internal mobility is an important part of mobility as well.
Thank you. Carol, anything you'd like to add? And then I'll come to David.
I have a little bit of delay on my mute. Yes, I mean, I think starting with the very youngest children, children are naturally curious about the world. The world is a much smaller, more connected place than it was when we were children. And I think they have access to, many children have access to all sorts of things. Some children don't, as we know, in vulnerable countries. A book can be a valuable thing, and we can't take for granted an internet connection. But I think, I'd agree with what Julie says about those connections. I work work with big international facilities where one country alone can't afford to build that facility, and that already brings people together. The Square Kilometre Array is a major array of radio telescopes. I mean, David mentioned UNESCO heritage status for Jodrell Bank Observatory. The international headquarters of the Square Kilometre Array is at Jodrell Bank Observatory, but part of the array is being built in South Africa and another part is being built in Australia. So it's been fantastic to see the engagement and then the growth of that engagement with the different countries coming together in that international collaboration. I mean, you know, it's a vast piece of science diplomacy, if you like, where we're trying to understand the nature of the universe, but the technology challenges we have there, everything from green computing, how we deliver energy, how we just put the infrastructure in of, you know, hundreds of thousands of dishes and the kind of fibers that connect them, will revolutionize the infrastructure within the country, but also the opportunities for skilled young people. But I think what's touched me personally, particularly while I've been in my FCO role, my CDO role now, and some of the engagement I've done actually with the British Council, this was not a planted question, Kieran, but I remember giving a public talk in Bulgaria, and it was the smallest children. I mean, there was a little girl who was about 6 years old, and English was her second language, and she came up and she asked me some really hard questions about black holes, and then she listened to the answers, which I'm ashamed I had to give in English. I couldn't give them back in her native tongue, and that was hugely inspiring for me. And they were young people waiting for my autograph. I mean, I've never felt like a rock star, and I never expected to feel like one, but that level of engagement, that thrill of knowing or asking questions and wanting to know about the world, and who knows what they'll go on to do. So I think that human connection, you know, Julie said science is a connecting thing, and I think it's a human endeavor. You know, it really is wanting to know about the world around us. It's something we've done since the dawn of time.
Thank you. David.
Yes, just another dimension on all of this, and that is something which we can't do so well at the moment, which is conferencing. For young people, it's absolutely vital that they attend conferences and they learn to give papers or present particular poster sessions, because when they go to conferences as a young researcher, they will undoubtedly be inspired by what they hear of what is going on amongst a whole range of people from all over the world. They'll also meet the luminaries in their field, and you know, that's very important that they see the people and can be inspired by them. And if they give a paper or something early on, they'll be very scared. And those scary moments when you're talking to this huge number of your peers and luminaries is a very salutary experience. It's very good that young people have that, because it builds relationships, particularly amongst that young cohort that might be attending a conference. And that's what starts the chemistry that eventually leads to collaborations and mutual understanding. So I put a lot of kudos behind the sort of the conferencing activity for young scientists.
Thank you. Can I change tack again? You know, we all have a STEM background on this panel. What about the humanities? I ask that question from a few points of view. One is, things become fashionable. There's a great push on engineering or a great push on science. But there's always a risk it's to the exclusion of something else. And the second one was a question that came up in the Q&A around, do nations really have research priorities? Because a lot of what we've been talking about is having systems, and then the quality of the science drives the research which is done, rather than saying we're going to do a lot of research into biochemical engineering, which I would love. But how do we make sure that the science we're talking about is that breadth that Carol mentioned? It's science in its widest sense, and actually we're talking about the humanities as well, because in my past, when we had industrial accidents, it wasn't the equations which suddenly decided to do something strange. It was usually a human factor. David, can I start with you?
Yes, certainly, Kieran. Actually, many of our designations have cultural, very, very strong cultural overlays, because we're talking about places and people, and the whole idea of our biosphere reserves and our geoparks is that they link science with their local communities and expose that to a wider audience. And so in these geoparks, while science takes the lead in terms of why they're there, the communities that get involved may be demonstrating something to do with their history and the background of these regions. There may be cultural dimensions that are brought in that actually connect with the public, such as literature and music. I mean, we have a geopark in the Shetlands, and you would not believe some of the activities that celebrate the cultural niceties of being a Shetlander and where they are in that remote part of our country. So I think there are lots of ways in which we in UNESCO science can do this. But having said that, I mean, you know, I spent most of my academic career in Cambridge. I spent a lot of time going and listening to a lot of other things than just science. And I think it's very incumbent on us to make sure that that milieu is available to scientists, and that science does connect with history, culture, literature, music, etc.
Carol, did you want to add?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I think this is hugely important, and I think particularly as we look forward to the pace of increase in technological development. The Royal Society published a really important report a couple of weeks ago on heritable genome editing technology, and I think it's incredibly important that we engage across our whole research base with our humanities colleagues, social scientists, and also engage society in those conversations, because just because a scientist can do something in a lab, there has to be a wider societal question about whether they should. And this goes back to one of the comments that Julie made about the UK having a world-leading reputation for standards and regulatory frameworks. And those standards come to pass because we have wide conversations across society about where the boundaries of what we should do and what we can do start to interface. And I think that this is particularly important as we talk about artificial intelligence, as we're talking about genome editing, and we're talking about all of those ethical pieces that, as I say, for scientists, you know, we're driven by curiosity, we're single-minded in the lab, and actually that's a huge force for good, but science should always be considered as dual use, and it's society that has to have that conversation about where the boundaries of stopping doing something just because you can, should you or shouldn't you. And then on the international stage, I think that's also really important that we then communicate with other countries based on what the science is feasible to do and what we should and shouldn't do, and that's where those multilateral organisations and treaty level agreements come in.
Thanks. We do, as the British Council, we do a lot of research polling with 18 to 34-year-olds, and we ask, you know, what do you think of the UK? What's the UK famous for? What do you think it's good at? And innovation, creativity, research, universities all come out at the top. But when we ask a slightly different question, which is who's at the cutting edge of technology and of science, the UK is fourth. Is that a problem of communication? Is that how we talk about it? One of the things we're investigating is whether it's you know, the device that you work with, you know, might be a sort of Sony rather than a recognisable UK brand. Is it as simple as that? Any views as to what the perceptions may be? Julie, can I start with you again? You're looking too quiet.
Well, I haven't seen that kind of polling, but much of it may be just the language that's used on social media, I think. But also, there are certain countries and certain companies around the world that stress that how far ahead they are with technology, that they're at the cutting edge, that you need to buy something from them. So I think some of it may just be advertising in a sense. But I think it's good that when they talk about creativity and everything like that, because that really does bring together scientists and people working in the humanities. So, I mean, it exactly speaks to what Carol was talking about. And if I could just say a comment on what Carol's comments, ethics is fundamental to this. At the Royal Society, we work very closely with the British Academy in many of our reports. And in the data science world at the moment, ethics is really critical. Everybody knows that there's data all over the place, but what you can do with it needs to have certain ethical standards. And in fact, I'd go a step forward further, because in the science and the law program that I run at the Royal Society, It's about what should the legal regulations be in some cases, because scientists, they're just very keen to be in the lab, and they can do this, but what's the regulation? What's the moderation of it? And that's a very interesting set of questions, which again brings together scientists and humanities scholars.
Now, I've been told I have to draw to a close, but Carol has pointed out to me that I have an ARM chip in my phone, so I should be paying better attention, I think. But look, can I just say, thank you, and promise that from the British Council point of view, the kind of priority that we have in science, which are around science communications through the FameLab type events, the early career mobility, and the partnerships that we facilitate. I think we're absolutely committed to continuing to do those and working with great colleagues and partners like Julie at the Royal Society, Carol in her Chief Scientific Advisor role, and indeed David in the UNESCO work. So thank you very, very much. Thank you everybody who's participated, and whatever the virtual equivalent of a round of applause for our panel is, I'm sure it's happening as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.